Good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished guests and speakers to our fourth annual Gulf International Conference, the Gulf in Transition, New Factions, Shifting Foundation, and an Uncertain Future. For those of you that I have not yet had the pleasure to meet, virtually or in person. I'm Dania Laffer, the Executive Director at Gulf International Forum. We are proud that we are the only Washington, D.C. think tank that talks with the Gulf and not at the region. We bring together Washington and Gulf based experts to share differing, often clashing views. Each of these events demonstrate our commitment to open, reasoned, and objective discussion of difficult subjects. Over the next 4 days, our fourth annual conference will spotlight key issues affecting the future of the Gulf region, actually. States across the region face an increasingly uncertain future. They recognize that confrontation has produced decreasing marginal returns. Accordingly, they have taken some initiative to de escalate. Nothing in the Gulf has remained static, but nothing is disconnected from its path. 2021 marks the 40 years since the establishment of the Gulf Cooperation Council in 1980. It was primarily established as a reaction to the Iranian Revolution. Today, the institution faces not only the same challenges, but many new threats to its unity. New developments such as increased American oil and gas production and climate change pose a major threat to the Gulf's long term economic future. These developments exacerbate as the effects of a wave of educated youth looking for jobs that yet do not exist. Efforts to diversify GCC economies away from the dependence on hydrocarbons remains in their infancy, and some fear diversification will make dealing with youth unemployment even more difficult. The last three American presidents have sent conflicting signals on US commitment to the Gulf states' security. The GCC states have reacted by reaching out to other major powers to diversify their regional security arrangement. The consequences of the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan have reverberated throughout the Gulf. In the meantime, the US and Iran still have not managed to restart negotiations with the new government of Iran to join the JCPOA. Conservatives in Iran are consolidating more power, while important political players in the United States lobby the Biden administration to continue Trump's maximum pressure, despite its failure to pressure Tehran into changing its behavior. Although it does not get its due attention, the war in Yemen drags on without visible signs of resolution, while its population suffers from the onslaught of war, famine, and COVID 19. Throughout the week, our various experts will fully address the following key issues, shedding light on the political landscape, the current economic context, and geopolitical trends we see unfolding today. Will the GCC remain relevant as a vehicle for coordinating the Arab Gulf states' responses to the many challenges they face, or will it become increasingly moribund in the face of insuperable problems? Will the many newly initiated diplomatic engagements between individual GCC states and Iran lead to a coordinated GCC attempt to resolve problems broadly? And how do these initiatives affect the unknown future of the JCPOA negotiations? How will the region's large demographic youth be affected as the GCC states edge closer to 2030 visions and attempt to diversify their economies while simultaneously transitioning to a net zero future? What impact will elections taking place in the Gulf states at the end of 2021 have on the future viability of Gulf parliaments? I am certain that Many of our panelists will disagree, and we have consistently emphasized a healthy discussion demands such disagreement, and our forum welcomes it. Now it's with great pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, Tim Constantine, for our exceptional panel lined up for you. The GCC at 40, Continued Rivalry or Shared Interests. Tim Constantine is the host and owner of the nationally renowned The Capitol Hill Show. He is also in charge of diplomacy and external affairs for the Washington Times. Additionally, he serves as the national publications writer and podcast host. Without further ado, Tim.
Dr. Thaver, thanks so much. It's great to be here for the Gulf in transition, new factions, shifting foundations, and an uncertain future. This first panel discussion, I think, is a great one. The opening session is called GCC at 40. Is it a continued rivalry, or will there be shared interests? And the GCC has always had staggering potential, and yet that C that stands for cooperation has sometimes been trouble and held back on that potential. So we've got a great panel of 4 experts who will share with you their opinion on what's going on in the Gulf, what the future holds. And I would encourage each of you, if you look to the right side of your screen, there's a comment section. And so as each of the panelists speaks, if you have questions, please just type them in there. And after all 4 of our panelists have spoken, we will take questions and offer answers to those questions from all the panelists. So if you have a question for one panelist or for all 4, just make that note on the side. Our first panelist is Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. He is a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East, Rice University, also non-residential senior fellow at Gulf International Forum. Works across the disciplines of political science, international relations, and international political economy. His research examines the changing position of Persian Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of longer-term non-military challenges to regional security. Dr. Ulrichsen, let me set up the question for you, and you'll have 7 or 8 minutes. How have the intra-Gulf tensions of recent years affected the future of the GCC?
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Danya Thafo and the GIF for putting the conference together and for inviting me to be on the panel. I think I'd begin my comments by saying that the GCC has survived to be 40. It's reached its 40th anniversary. And given the tension over the past decade with 2 serious crises, first in 2014 and then since 2017 until the beginning of this year, I think just reaching 40 is an achievement in itself. The fact that the GCC continues to exist, and in fact continue to exist throughout the blockade of Qatar in terms of its committees continuing to meet. It's continued to exist on a technocratic, if maybe less of a political level than it had done in the past. So that's one thing, the GCC is still with us. I think the other thing to note at the beginning is that we can perhaps now look back on the decade between 2010, 2011 and 2020 as a period of time with a start point and an end point, beginning with the Arab uprisings, continuing with the withdrawal of ambassadors from Qatar in 2013-14, the blockade from 2017 to the end of last year, but ending really in 2020, partly because the pandemic came along and really uprooted the entire landscape, not just in the Gulf, but around the world, a sort of black swan event, which has really reshaped priorities in many ways, but also because we had the ending of the Donald Trump presidency, which in my view had its sort of unorthodox style of policymaking had actually contributed to the feeling perhaps in some Gulf capitals in 2017 that they could almost do as they please. And I think it was no coincidence that the rift with Qatar was ultimately resolved during a transition between the Trump presidency and the Biden administration in early January. There was quite simply no more mileage in that crisis to continue, at least for the next 4 years. And so I think we have had a reconciliation of sorts. So we can now look at that time period as one in which individual Gulf countries sought to shape the pace and direction of change post-Arab Spring in their own different ways and interests, and of course set up that kind of fundamental clash over priorities, which also extended beyond the Gulf. If we think about some of the rifts between Saudi and UAE and Turkey, for example, as well. So it wasn't just an issue within the Gulf. Where we stand today, I think, is that in my view, the reconciliation that we saw at the beginning of the year is proving more effective and potentially more durable than the 2014 Riyadh Agreement, which ended the previous round of the Gulf rift, in the sense that the 2014 agreement seemed to be made, put on a shelf, and then left. And then in 2017, it then became really the sort of trigger for an entirely new round of different interpretations and kind of blame games between all the parties claiming the other had breached it. Whereas with 2020, with the Al Ula agreement at the beginning of this year, we have at least seen working parties, groups continuing to meet on a bilateral level. So Qataris meeting with Emiratis, Qataris meeting with Saudis, with Egyptians, maybe less so with Bahrain. But at least I think dividing the issues into a set of country-specific points, which can be dealt with in a sort of more structured and specific way than perhaps we saw in 2014. And I think that's producing results. And one of those results, of course, is that we've seen a gradual resumption of higher and higher level meetings. Emir Tamim went to Saudi Arabia to meet Mohammed bin Salman at the end of May. And then, of course, there was that rather famous meeting of Tamim, Mohammed bin Salman, and Takhnoun bin Zayed in, I think it was in Neom, or at least on the Red Sea coast, in September, when they looked like they'd all come out of the gym, or maybe run into each other at the gym. And then we've also seen meetings between senior Qatari and Emirati officials as well. So I think that's a sign that the reconciliation is at least genuine for now. It's probably more than tactical. I think it's a recognition in the Gulf that all the leaders have quite changed priorities with the pandemic and, of course, with the ending of the Trump presidency. And, of course, they also have issues, I think, as Dania said in the introduction, where we now have 3 successive US presidencies that Gulf leaders aren't quite sure where they stand. We had Obama, of course, with the negotiations of the JCPOA, where Gulf leaders to some extent felt cut out, especially with the secret negotiations that were held in Oman for the first year and a bit. We had Trump, and from the Qatari point of view, Trump's support of Saudi Arabia and the UAE at the initial stage of the blockade, although he quickly changed his mind. And from the Saudi and Emirati point of view in 2019, the attacks on maritime and energy facilities, which didn't lead to an overt US response. And in fact, Donald Trump, 2 days after the 2019 attack on Abqaiq and Al Khuraiz, the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, Trump specifically said that was an attack on Saudi Arabia, it wasn't an attack on the US, thereby drawing a distinction between the two. And I think the calculation had been in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that especially where Iran or Iran's regional proxies was concerned, there was no distinction between US and their interests. And Trump was subtly indicating actually there was. And I think it's no coincidence that we almost immediately saw a very different message coming out of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, at least signs of trying to de-escalate tensions, to make them manageable and containable. And this predated, of course, the transition in the US. We saw in January 2020 with the killing of Qasem Soleimani, how the Saudi Deputy Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman went to Washington to kind of publicly call for de-escalation. And the UAE leadership also made similar points. This is not the time for another war. So we are seeing perhaps a more realistic approach, a more pragmatic approach, in part because there's greater ambiguity about the role of the US, which ironically, I think, because I don't think Donald Trump necessarily thought this through, but it has had the impact of sort of making leaders in the Gulf perhaps cut the cloth according to their needs in more of a sustainable way. And I think that's to be welcomed. Now, we also had the withdrawal from Afghanistan in August, which I think will have alarmed Gulf leaders, the way it was conducted, the lack of a thought process, a lack of strategic kind of interest in the region, which has alarmed, I think, leaders and is really going to lead them to begin to try to explore alternatives, not necessarily replacing the US, but supplementing it. And I think that, again, will lead to a more balanced region in the future, just because no one party will necessarily take sides in the region to anything like the same extent we've seen with the US since 1979. So with that, I'll pass you back to Tim Constantine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ulrichsen. Elena Delozier is the Rubin Family Fellow in the Bernstein Program on Gulf and Energy Policy at the Washington Institute for Near Policy, where she specializes in Yemen, the Gulf states, and nuclear weapons and proliferation. She's also an adjunct assistant professor in the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She spent 8 years in the Middle East as a political analyst and trainer, including 6 years in the Gulf and 2 years in Lebanon. Ms. Delozier, how have the Gulf's interactions with Iran affected the dynamics within the GCC?
Thank you guys so much for having me. And thank you to Kristian for his comments, which are a good foundation for the ones that I'm about to make. So just a couple of comments about the Iran relationship. So first of all, as Dr. Danya pointed out, the GCC was formed in part in reaction to Iran. And so here we are 40 years later talking about that same issue. And what's happened in the last, say, decade or so, maybe even slightly longer, is this kind of perceived U.S. withdrawal from the region. So when I first went to the region in 2011, a decade ago, the folks there were already talking about this kind of U.S. withdrawal. Now, the part of that I want to sort of contextualize is that it's a little bit more of a perceived psychological withdrawal than an actual military withdrawal. So the U.S. still has quite a bit of equipment and forces throughout the Arabian Peninsula, including in the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi, et cetera. So it isn't like the Fifth Fleet is leaving necessarily, but there is this kind of perceived psychological withdrawal as the U.S. Deals with kind of war fatigue post-Iraq and post-Afghanistan. And this, there are a lot of Americans who talk about forever wars, and even Americans that don't follow the Middle East like all of us do just have this sense of like, what are we doing, quote unquote, over there? So there's this sort of fatigue coming from the American people that policymakers are responding to, which is then leading to what I would call a kind of psychological withdrawal from the region. And so the Gulf states in particular have really been paying attention to this for the last decade. And it's been across 3 presidents. So something that you'll hear from the Gulf states a lot is that the U.S. is really unpredictable and that that's really annoying. And since we change presidents all the time, they can't ever predict kind of what we're going to do in 5 years, literally, because there could be a different person in power and they don't know who it's going to be. And so the U.S. is really unpredictable. But on this particular issue, the U.S. has been consistent across 3 presidents, which is to sort of pivot to Asia, get out of the Middle East, that kind of thing. And so what has happened over the last decade as the Gulf states have sort of dealt with, the question at first was, is this going to last? Then the question was, okay, what do we do about it? And now there's sort of an acceptance that the U.S. isn't going to play the same role in the region as it has in the past. And so the Gulf states themselves have to step up. And as part of that, they've started talking to Iran. Now, some of the Gulf states have always talked to Iran, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, et cetera. This is not a black and white thing where it was off before and it's on now. But there is more of a sense of having to take care of our own that's coming out of the Gulf. And so there's a lot more consistent talking with Iran. And so the one that's probably the most notable right now are the Saudis talking to Iran. So the relations between Saudi and Iran were stunted quite a bit a couple years ago in 2016, whenever there was an incident and diplomatic relations were broken. And then in 2019, there was an attack on the upcake facilities in Saudi, the oil facilities, that actually really had a huge effect on Saudi foreign policy at the time. Their policy on Yemen shifted drastically. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but there was a majorly hard pivot after the upcake attacks. The way that I always characterize that is that the Patriot missiles were pointed towards Yemen, and the missiles for the upcake attack came from the north. So, you know, Saudi, I think, kind of saw like, oh gosh, the threats are coming from all sides. And maybe Yemen is not our greatest threat. Maybe actually Iran is something we should focus on, and maybe Qatar is something that we should try to patch up. And so what you've seen since 2019 is a completely different policy in Yemen and a completely different policy towards Qatar. Now, Iran may learn the wrong lesson from that, right? Which is that the attack was effective in some way. But in any case, the Saudis and the Iranians are now in talks. And I would just characterize those talks as Iran wanting normalization of relations and the Saudis wanting something else in return. And the Iranians don't really want to give anything else in return. And there might be a little bit of a sense that the Iranians can help on Yemen in a way that I'm not sure is actually correct. And again, we can talk about Yemen in the Q&A. But there is sort of a notion that Saudi and Iran might normalize relations again. That doesn't necessarily mean they're best friends. That doesn't mean that that they do decide any of these other larger issues. But certainly Iran being having some sort of say in Yemen is not something most of the Gulf states really love, to put it lightly. So the UAE is also talking with Iran. The Qataris share a gas field, so they're sort of always talking to Iran and have a little bit of a different relationship in general. And Iran also helped them through the Gulf Rift. Allowed them to use their airspace whenever the Saudis and Emiratis cut off the airspace, things like that. So the Qatar-Iran relationship has really been shaped differently in the last couple of years. Bahrain has always been a little bit more nervous about Iran. You know, Iranian newspapers will occasionally refer to Bahrain as part of Iran. Bahrain really doesn't like that. And so in the way that Kuwait is always a bit nervous about Iraq, Bahrain is always a bit nervous about Iran. And then lastly, just Oman. Oman has a very different policy towards Iran, which is kind of an active neutrality policy. So they maintain good relations with the Iranians. The Iranians are constantly coming to Oman and meeting with them. But they are a little bit more nervous about the more radical elements in Iran. Of course, I think the Omanis probably prefer more moderate politicians in general across the region. So I don't think you should mistake Oman's neutrality policy as necessarily liking the leadership in Iran, in the same way that just because they're friendly with the UAE or the Saudis or the Yemenis or the Kuwaitis or whoever, it doesn't mean that they don't have their own perspectives on the leadership of those countries. And so just to sum up, I think the thing to watch going forward is how the Gulf states manage their relationship with Iran, quote unquote, on their own. So now that the U.S. is, as Kristian remarked, when the upcake attacks happened, the U.S. did not, fly in and save the day. The Iranians noted that, but so did the Saudis. So I think that's the kind of thing to kind of keep an eye on, is how do the Gulf states sort of, when they say they'll take care of it on their own, what does that actually mean going forward?
Thanks very much. A reminder to everyone that if you have questions, look at the column over on the right of your screen. You can type in your questions. I have a sneaking suspicion that she has just rooted up a number of questions. At the conclusion of all four of our speakers, we will go through a question and answer period, and you can direct it at one of our panelists. You can direct a question to all of our panelists, but please feel free to type those in now. And at the conclusion of all four panelists, we'll come back and we will have that open discussion. Dr. Hesham Alghannam is Senior Advisor and Program Director of the International Studies Program, Gulf Research Center, Cambridge. He's a Saudi political scientist and former Fulbright Fellow at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. He worked on issues of ballistic missiles, the political economy of the GCC, social movements, Arab upheavals, political Islam, war strategies, and crisis management. He had an urgent situation and cannot be with us live. However, went ahead and recorded his remarks. So we have those. In his remarks, he's going to address the future of the GCC, and particularly, how do the Saudis view the GCC's future?
I would say continued competition, but at the same time shared interests. But allow me first to say that it's important when analyzing Gulf politics, especially at these changing times, to not repeat cliches we usually hear in the media or in sometimes diplomatic circles, and unfortunately even within the walls of think tanks. Since Al-Ula, we are witnessing rapid improvement in the relationships between the GCC states. It would be difficult and hard to deny that. This improvement is certainly driven by shared interests. Otherwise, it would not happen. Specifically between the Saudis and Qataris, Saudis and Omanis, and even between the Qataris and other Gulf states. I mean UAE and Bahrain, but definitely not on the same pace. I'm not saying here that disagreements have disappeared suddenly. No, this would be something untrue to say, and naive also. And actually the competition, especially on the economic side between these states, would probably accelerate in the near future. And they must find a way to deal with the expected consequences of such competition. And it will be at certain times very rough. Add to this that we have major fundamental challenges facing us related to the structure of the region as a whole and the regimes itself. This is not the European Union. On one hand, we have conservative monarchies, maybe not very conservative lately, especially in their foreign policy practices, which in my opinion, being less conservative, unlike what the media or popular line of analysis would probably suggest, will actually help us to move away from the unfortunate zero-sum game that governs the relationship between these states and also with other states and regimes in the region that are not very conservative, such as the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a revolutionary regime, not very revolutionary when it comes to certain parts of the region, such as Syria or Lebanon or even Iraq. But in any case, it's a regime since its existence and since it came to power, seeks to and also declares that it wants to change the status quo that dominated the region, a status quo that was supported by Western powers, Americans and Europeans for decades. So if these states, I mean the GCC states, are trying to find, let's say, an equation to talk and deal with Iran, which they have a serious security problem with. Iran basically threatens their stability. They should find a way to deal with each other, especially that the expected nature of future issues between them would mostly be under the economy and trade banner. And it's not a secret that we witnessed an alteration of the hostile rhetoric between these states to a more moderate one from all sides, actually. This wouldn't be sufficient in itself, but a necessary step and a prerequisite, in my opinion, for any constructive resolution or maybe a grand deal between these states. The GCC states are taking a wiser path now, at least in their public announcements, and are seeking to take their fate into their own hands, probably driven by the withdrawal of the US from the region. And let me say that disagreements or even disputes are also healthy, in my opinion, and a natural part of the evolvement of these states. This is something that needs to happen sooner or later. We should not look at these states as if they were mashayikh qabiliya, sheikh kingdoms that solve their problems in a traditional tribalistic style, which was maybe normal in the past, but not now. These are nation states in the making, states a work in progress, states that are trying to depart from the rentier model. And this whole difficult and near impossible process, I would say, comes with positives and negatives that are associated with this transformation. But all the GCC states have good reasons and enormous benefits in breaking the old and current pattern of maintaining the status quo of relationships between them, which is filled with, I'm being transparent here, filled with suspicion and lack of trust. The need for a deal, a practical deal, and a working plan between these states is not just empty talk. It's necessary and urgent, in my opinion. I'll give an example, really very brief, on the urgency of the collective challenges that faces these states. Now the GCC states are realizing that climate change and global warming is real. Major industries around the world are reducing their carbon footprint, and the Gulf states could lose more than half their income in less than 10 years. This is a serious and an existential threat that faces all these countries, with no exception. But if I speak about the Saudi side, I would say that the focus of the Saudis would be good governance. And actually, this is the main challenge that faces all Gulf states, all of them with no exception, from Oman to UAE to Qatar to Bahrain and Kuwait, with different degrees. But securing Riyadh economic interests is certainly on top of the list for the Saudis. But at the same time, having acceptable and good relations with all GCC states is a genuine interest for the kingdom. And it will assist, for a good reason, it will assist Riyadh in establishing itself as a constructive regional player. International and regional support for the kingdom's security becomes more likely with this approach. Now, is it tactical? It could be, but I do not believe so, for the simple reason that the kingdom has a huge and difficult economic project, and new generation demands, massive internal demands, and wants to focus on that. The need for good governance cannot be delayed for the Saudis. And also because the Saudis understand that the security of the region and the Gulf now lies in the hand of the Gulf states, not the US or any external power. So for the Saudis, it's both security and economy, and going forward with Vision 2030. Whatever it takes to achieve this, the kingdom will engage in. So de-escalation or de-confliction in the region and strong GCC are very logical steps in that context for the Saudis. And let me be also transparent here. It's also better for the Saudis to have the GCC states on board and on their side, or at least neutral and in face of other powers in the region. I mean the Iranians and Turks. And I'm not saying that balancing economic competition and security concerns would be easy. No, at all. And improving the business environment, becoming more open, attracting more FDI, and having some sort of political alignment with other Gulf states would not be something easy to achieve. It's a delicate balance, and it would be probably a win-loss situation. I'm familiar with the counter argument, but what I'm saying is even if it was a loss, it would be an acceptable loss and maybe necessary in the grand scheme of things. But we have to wait and see if this is achievable at all, especially that we have states with great differences in their size, population, and also economic power, and even security concerns. But as I said, Riyadh would try its best to make this work, as having a Gulfi semi-unified front, if I may say, would help Riyadh on multiple paths and different levels. I also think that the same goes also for other GCC states, with all their disagreements. They all have strategic plans, which has social and economic and political components and goals. And these strategic plans will require stable societies, vibrant economies, and this cannot be achieved in a hostile Gulf or a neighborhood. And despite what we hear from some voices on all sides, I believe that fostering a political climate conducive for exchange and agreements is a shared interest for all, because the competition could be very costly if not managed very well. In any case, and knowing that everything in this region, the Gulf specifically, is a work in progress and will remain so in the near future. So if I want to choose a main theme for future Gulf politics and relations, I would say reasonable optimism and the belief and hope that these states may and could find a way to manage contradictions and expectations at the same time, which is, as I said, is not an easy task. Thank you.
Our fourth and final panelist, Ambassador Gerald Feierstein, is a senior vice president and distinguished senior fellow on U.S. diplomacy at MEI. He retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in May 2016 after a 41-year career with the personal rank of career minister. As a diplomat, he served in 9 overseas postings, including 3 tours in Pakistan, as well as assignments in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Tunisia. In 2010, President Obama appointed him U.S. ambassador to Yemen, where he served until 2013. And from that time until his retirement, Ambassador was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Ambassador, we want to hear from you. The question, how will the U.S. pivot to Asia affect the USGCC relationship?
Thank you, Tim, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, and also to be with my fellow panelists. I think that Danya and Kristian and Elena all touched a little bit on the basic issues that we want to discuss about where is the United States going, what is the United States posture vis-a-vis the GCC states going to be as we continue to develop our strategic competition, particularly with China and Russia. And what I would say is that what you think about where the United States is going depends on where you're sitting. There are different perspectives between the United States and our friends and partners in the region about what all that means. From a U.S. perspective, I would say that despite this change, and as I think has already been pointed out, this pivot to Asia has been something that's been discussed here in the United States for a number of years, at least going back to the Obama administration, if not even before that, that despite our increasing focus on the issues of East Asia, of security in the South China Sea, et cetera, there has not actually been any decline in our role in the region or our commitment to Gulf security. The point is often made here by American officials that there has not been any retrenchment of U.S. military presence in the region. And Elena ticked off where we still have our presence, the Fifth Fleet, land presence throughout the GCC states, strong security presence in the Red Sea and in Djibouti. And also there's not been any change in terms of the U.S. posture towards those elements that are of greatest concern for GCC security, particularly Iran and the threat of violent extremism and terrorism in the region. So the U.S. military and security posture has really not been changed. Moreover, the reality is that Gulf militaries are still built largely around a U.S. military architecture, U.S. military doctrine, and our engagement with the Gulf militaries is unchanged. I would note that just today, we've seen the overflight of the region by a U.S. B-1B bomber that was accompanied by partner air forces from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, from Israel, and others. So the integration of U.S. and Gulf militaries is as robust as it has always been. On the diplomatic front, I would also say that U.S. policy has engaged in ways that support fundamental Gulf interests. That we continue to work very closely with the Gulf states on issues of economic diversification, that we continue to support core Gulf security initiatives and security concerns through our diplomatic engagement. The Abraham Accords are an example where the U.S. diplomatically has facilitated steps that ensure and expand and deepen Gulf security interests, and so those issues are continuing. That's a U.S. perspective. The perspective on the Gulf side is somewhat different. They acknowledge, and they have not changed their perspective, that the U.S. remains the #1 security partner for the GCC. But there is a big question mark. They say that there is no doubt in their minds that U.S. reliability has declined. They're not sure where the United States is leading, what our direction is. The U.S. is sounding an uncertain trumpet from a Gulf perspective. Again, I think my colleagues have already noted some of the issues that have raised doubts in the minds of our Gulf partners. Our hesitation to respond to Iranian aggressive moves in 2019, not only the Upcake attack, but also the attack on shipping in Fujairah and elsewhere, have created doubts about whether the United States' commitment to defend our Gulf partners from Iranian aggression is still as strong. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, although widely understood that it was happening, nevertheless has the way it happened has reinforced question marks. There is a perception that even though the U.S. says our military presence in the region remains as robust as ever, nevertheless, they see signs, for example, the withdrawal of Patriot missiles from Saudi Arabia, that have been interpreted as an indicator of declining U.S. presence. And again, doubts persist about the nature of our engagement with Iran. What does it mean? What is going to happen in terms of the U.S. negotiations on a return to the JCPOA? Are we once again going to pursue that diplomatic initiative with Iran in a way that is perceived in the Gulf as coming at their expense, in ignoring some of the issues related to Iranian intervention in internal affairs, development of ballistic missiles, support for terrorism, and other issues that are of greater concern to our Gulf partners than perhaps the nuclear file is. And so all of these issues have created doubts. What does that mean in terms of where we're going? What can we anticipate in the future development of USGCC relations? I think it's fair to say that the United States is probably going to remain as the #1 military and security partner. Again, the entire structure of Gulf militaries is built around their cooperation and coordination with the United States. That's not something that can be easily changed or thrown away. And so that is going to change, is going to remain a core pillar in Gulf security analyses. But it's also true that the United States is no longer the #1 economic partner for the Gulf. That role is now being played by China. And we have received very clear signals from our friends in the Gulf that while they continue to count on the United States, while they continue to see the U.S. as their best friend, nevertheless, they have no intention of being drawn into a conflict, real or rhetorical, between the United States and China. They recognize and value the relationships that have developed with both of those partners. Russia also is going to continue to look for opportunities to engage in the Gulf region. The role that they play in OPEC Plus is going to be an important part of the energy environment going forward for all of the Gulf states. They will find ways, and they would love to be able to sell their own military equipment to the Gulf states, and that's going to continue to be a factor. The rise of Israel's cooperation with the GCC is also notable. It's not adverse to U.S. interests, but it does provide the GCC states with an alternative partner that sees the region much like the GCC states do, and in some ways perhaps sees diplomatically and politically and from a security perspective, sees the region more closely aligned with the GCC than the U.S. policy is. And so that's also going to be a factor. And finally, I should make the point that many of these changes, even though they're related to what is seen as a changing U.S. interest in the region, also reflect changes in the Gulf states themselves. And what we've seen really over the past 5, 6, 8 years in Abu Dhabi and in Riyadh in particular, increasing assertiveness in terms of how they not only perceive their own interests, but also how they intend to adopt policies that pursue their interests, even at times that come into conflict with U.S. preferences. And if you look at some of the issues, particularly in the Horn of Africa and Somalia and Sudan, or even farther abroad in Libya or in Egypt, there have been times where the Gulf states pursued interests and pursued policies that were not consistent with where the U.S. wanted to go. I think that this is going to be a reality that we're going to be dealing with, and it's going to be a challenge to the relationship going forward. The United States is simply going to have to work harder in order to convince the Gulf states that the policies that we're pursuing are in fact policies that they can feel comfortable with and endorse. So let me stop there.
Ambassador, thank you very much. A reminder to everyone, this is your opportunity now to ask our experts questions. If you look to the chat section on the right of your screen, you can type in your questions. You can direct it to the entire panel. You can direct it to one individual panelist, and we will run through. We've got probably 20 or 25 minutes, so we will cover a lot of ground here. Elena, I'm going to start with you with the first question. The ambassador went down the road here of perception of the U.S., and you touched on this as well with the inconsistencies in the different administrations. We saw the Obama-Biden administration take a certain tact toward Iran. They did not get their nuclear agreement agreed to by the United States Congress, by the Senate, and so it was essentially a State Department policy. Trump comes in, changes that policy. Now we see Biden coming in and looking to go back to the old Obama-Biden policy and open those nuclear discussions with Iran again. From the perception of the Gulf states, how does that inconsistency impact the credibility of the United States?
Yeah, so I think this is some of the unpredictability that I mentioned. And the Gulf states are really concerned about that. Now, on the nuclear, I mean, that would just be one example, and they could give you 10 others of
Right.
that kind of, that's like such a great example of exactly that kind of unpredictability that the Gulf states perceive. And they say, like, if you're just going to flip flop constantly on policies, like, we don't know where we stand, and we can't, I would say the F-35 is another example, although the details are very different. But this idea that the Trump administration's view of the F-35 issue was very different than the Biden administration now. And, so things move under certain administrations and then slow down under others. And it's just frustrating for the Gulf states. So I think on that point, I think that's a great example of the point I was making on that. Now, on the nuclear issue in particular, one thing that's changed since 2015 is the Gulf states' relationship with Israel. And so, of course, this is not with all of the Gulf states, but as you know, the UAE and Bahrain have decided to normalize relationships with Israel. And the UAE goes out of its way to make clear that it has the same goals and perceives the same threats in the region as Israel, i.e. Iran. And so now when the Biden administration is trying to renegotiate JCPOA, which, by the way, is not going terribly well. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than they would like it to be, but just for purposes of this conversation, when they're having the conversations with their partners in the region, whether it's the Gulf states or Israel, those conversations are a little bit more in line with each other than they were in, when the first time that JCPOA came around. On the issue of Congress not having to pass the JCPOA, this is a great point that you make, because it's something that a lot of people just didn't know, which is the reason it's called a plan of action, which is really a term that means not very much. I mean, it's words that don't have a ton of weight behind them. It's not an alliance. It's not a treaty. It's not an agreement even. It's a plan. And so, because all those other words, treaty, agreement, framework, there's a whole list of words that if you use that word, it suddenly needs, treaty verification through our congressional system, but also through Iran's system. So let's not forget that Iran has, a legislature as well. And so not only was the US trying to avoid having to get this passed by their legislature, so is Iran. And there's also other countries involved. And so it was just easier for all the countries involved to say, let's just call it a plan, and then nobody has to approve it. But to your point, that also makes it less sort of set in stone, which allows the next president to have a different policy on it.
Thanks very much. If anyone has a question, please feel free to submit over on the right of your screen. You can type in your question, direct it to an individual on the panel, or to the entire panel. Either is fine. Second question goes to you, Kristian. You sound more optimistic about the UAE part of the disagreement with Qatar. Is that an accurate perception, or explain?
Well, I think there's a calculation, at least, that there was nothing more to be gained by continuing this dispute, especially once the Saudis had made it clear that they wanted it to end. And I think in 2017, probably also in 2014, the animosity had been driven by Abu Dhabi. I think in 2017, the fact that they could get Mohammed bin Salman, get the Saudis on board, greatly increased the strength of the action that they were trying to take. But by 2020, by the end of 2019, I think it was quite clear the Saudi leadership wanted this done, wanted it over, in part because Mohammed bin Salman wanted to present himself to the incoming Biden administration as someone who's able to, I think, learn the lessons of the previous 4 years and move on. We saw the way he was presented front and center at the Al Ula summit as a sort of peacemaker, that he was trying to present a very different image than the one that perhaps had been given over the previous couple of years. So I think it was just a pragmatic calculation from Abu Dhabi that it was sort of better to just sort of drop it. We saw a similar pragmatic calculation, as I think Elana has written about, in Yemen, where, again, the UAE leadership made a calculation that things hadn't gone as planned. It was better to not cut their losses, but better to at least to pursue a different approach. Whether or not that's durable, I think there are still obviously differences of approach between Mohammed bin Zayed and between the Qataris in how they view regional politics, how they view the nexus of politics and Islam, for example. I don't think they have necessarily gone away. I just think that the kind of regional circumstances have changed. And actually, Hesham mentioned it in his comments by sort of video link, that these competitive rivalries that we may now see the next sort of phase in the Gulf, especially post-pandemic, they actually may be more between Saudi and UAE as the two largest economies in the region. And so I think we are also perhaps seeing just a shifting sort of balance of interests, just because obviously the context is now so different than it was even 2 or 3 years ago.
Panel, and we'll start with Ambassador, with you first. But the question is, who do you think is the long-term U.S. strategic partner in the Middle East, Iran or the GCC? And then I would add to that question, or does it have to be an either or?
Sorry. What I was going to say is, realistically speaking, any suggestion that there's any kind of strategic partnership in the United States between the United States and Iran is wishful thinking and is likely to remain wishful thinking for many, many years to come. I mean, the reality is that even at the peak of U.S.-Iranian engagement in 2015, 2016, after the JCPOA was signed, realistically, nobody even anticipated that there was going to be restoration of diplomatic relations. I mean, we were able to work with the Iranians in order to achieve an agreement on a very basic elemental issue that really did not go very much beyond that. And certainly nothing has happened in the intervening years to make it appear realistic to think that the relationship between the United States and Iran is going to be anything but transactional at best for many years to come. The Iranians see U.S. continued presence in the region as a threat to their interests. The U.S. sees Iran as being an unproductive, unconstructive force for developments in the region, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, et cetera, in Iraq. So the basis for strategic cooperation between the two is not even dimly in view, and given the long years of close cooperation between the U.S. and our partners in the Gulf, I would anticipate that that's going to be the core pillar for the United States for a long time to come.
I think you've covered that pretty well. Kristian, anything you want to add?
I think I would agree with what Ambassador Feierstein just said. I would think what might be interesting is if there is a perceived disengagement from the US side, and again, perceptions and interpretations are what I think is driving this. If Gulf leaders begin to think about supplementing the US with other partnerships, those other partnerships, if it's Russia or China, for example, they will not take sides. They will try and balance their partnerships with the Gulf states with their partnerships with Iran. So I think that could be quite interesting to watch. But yeah, that would be what I would add.
Elena, let's go with the first question. Economics. There's been discussion of how with carbon issues and so on, how the economy will change dramatically in the next 10 years. The economic rivalries that go on within the GCC, what impact is that likely to have on them either working together or increasing the rivalry?
Yeah, so it's a great question because I do think things are changing. So, if the Gulf states weren't able to diversify their economies, the future Gulf state would be a poor one. And so whether the future Gulf state is a poor one, whether some of them are poor ones, whether none of them are poor ones, this is the question mark going forward. And I'm talking, a few decades down the line. But that's certainly what's on the mind of all of the leaders in the Gulf is how do we get our economies up and going? The UAE is particularly focused on this, as are the Saudis. But I think that that's what I should say is you hear the most about the Saudi and UAE focus on this. But in reality, all of the Gulf states are very, very focused on kind of how to push themselves forward and what niche market they might be able to capture. And so there is going to be competition as Riyadh and Dubai become competitors to kind of bring in the powerful Western companies, and not only the Western companies, but also as there's a rise in East Africa, for example, and also in West Africa and in all kinds of the countries that we used to think of as poor countries around the world, what we call emerging markets now are in fact emerging. And some of them are kind of breaking through the clouds. And coronavirus has put a little bit of a damper on some of them, but in the next, say, 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to have some economies that really matter that don't exist today in a way that really shapes things as much. And so, if those the companies that come out of those economies decide to base themselves in Riyadh versus Dubai or Dubai versus Riyadh. I mean, this is the market that those countries are really trying to capture. And so I think the future is one of competition. And I think we have to be careful that we don't see that economic competition as rivalry, that it just because, you know, there's some rule put in place in Dubai that Riyadh puts in place the next week, that doesn't mean MBS and MBZ are fighting. It could just be that both countries are trying to capture the same market. And they themselves say this, that like going forward, we'll be competing with each other economically.
We're going to have time for a couple more questions, so I would encourage you, if you have a question, please go to the comment section, just type it in. We will get it to our panelists. Ambassador, I want to throw you a little bit of a curveball here, and that is a couple years ago at this very conference, at the Gulf International Conference, I was on a panel and I was sitting beside an empty seat. That seat was supposed to be held by Jamal Khashoggi. At the time, there was great discussion after his death that was and this is a quote from one of the other panelists at that meeting that day, that was a game changer in the Gulf region. Was it a game changer as we look back 2 years from now? What impact has his death had long term, if any?
It's a very good question, Tim. I think that we're probably not at the end of that road. Look, I think that the death of Jamal Khashoggi had a significant impact on U.S. attitudes towards Saudi Arabia, towards the new Saudi leadership. Jamal was known and a friend of many of the people in this town who write about and think about U.S. relations with the region. It definitely put a major black mark in terms of attitudes towards the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. It's been several years now, and I think the repercussions of that have still not entirely played out. But there's also a reality that sets in, and we've seen it in the way the Biden administration has managed the relationship over these last 10 months. The fact of the matter is that Joe Biden on the campaign trail last year was talking about making Saudi Arabia a pariah state. He had made commitments about releasing the information that had been gathered by U.S. intelligence agencies about the murder, about responsibility for the murder. Soon after he came into office, in fact, they did release the CIA estimate of what had happened. But the fact of the matter is that they did not respond. They did not take any action on the basis of that release, except to implement a broad global new policy about what to do in the instance of individuals being clearly identifiable as responsible for extraterritorial assassinations. So, in the meantime, we've seen that John Kerry has made several trips to the kingdom, met with Mohammed bin Salman. We saw Jake Sullivan make a recent visit to the kingdom, met with Mohammed bin Salman. Everything that I'm hearing is that visit went well. That there was a good conversation, good discussion, and the fact of the matter is that I think that the U.S. is coming to grips with the fact that Mohammed bin Salman is going to be the next king of Saudi Arabia. That one way or the other, we are going to be dealing with MBS for many years to come, and that whether we are happy about it or not, whether there are still hard feelings, strong unhappiness about the role that MBS might have played in the decision to murder Jamal Khashoggi. There are issues of realpolitik that are going to come to the fore. We're going to deal with Saudi Arabia. We need to deal with Saudi Arabia. We need to maintain a close relationship, and that's going to be the determining factor going forward.
We've got time just to hear from each of you one more time. So we'll start with Kristian. Before we go, I started the discussion at the very beginning an hour ago, about 45 minutes ago, saying the staggering potential. They always talk about the great potential of the GCC, and yet somehow, due to conflict, it always comes up a little short. So are you optimistic about the future of the GCC? Just like 1 minute from each one of you, and let's start with you, Kristian.
It's a time of transition. We have new leaderships in Kuwait and Oman. We saw the departure of long-serving leaders last year in 2020. So I think everyone is beginning to get used to this new reality. My concern perhaps at the GCC is that all these meetings we've been talking about, these bilateral leadership meetings, are still happening between individual leaders. The GCC doesn't seem to be involved. And again, I just wonder to what extent the GCC as an organization, other than its continuing technocratic function, can regain some of the political relevance it had back in the days when all of its leaders used to meet for their annual conferences. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether they can regain that in the next couple of years, or whether we'll still see individual leaders continuing to sort of work on a bilateral basis with one another.
Elena, optimist, pessimist, realist? What are you?
Yeah, I think that, the context has just changed a lot. So the GCC was originally set up to be, a collection of small, relatively weak states. I mean, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but small, weaker states in, confronting the Iran threat. Again, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but today is just very, very different, where Saudi would not in any way consider itself weak. The UAE is not in the same position at all that it was in 1980. And so I think that just the context has changed quite a bit. So the question going forward is, if the GCC were strong, again, what would it be strong towards? Like, what would be the goal of the organization? What are they trying to achieve together? Are they working together to make sure, to have good post-oil economies, or is that competition at this stage? In which case, maybe the GCC, maybe it'll be more competition rather than cooperation. I'm not sure, but I do think the context is quite a bit different, and therefore the sort of role that the GCC plays is different going forward.
Ambassador, looking into your crystal ball, what do you see in the 5 years, the 10 years to come for the GCC?
Well, what I would say, again, it's a very good question, and we don't know. There are going to be pushes and pulls in different directions. What I would say is that I think the lesson learned from the pandemic last year is that regional cooperation, regional approaches to dealing with some of these critical issues that the region is going to be confronting over the coming years are going to be more and more important. Whether you're talking about public health, pandemic recovery, whether you're talking about some of the economic implications of what happened, or the economic implications of climate change, or the implications and challenges of climate change itself. These are going to be the issues that are going to be driving developments in the region. This is where the dynamics that the region is going to be confronting rest. And the reality is that no single state, even a state as wealthy as the UAE or Saudi Arabia, can overcome those challenges by itself. So I would say that what's going to be the most important thing going forward is regional cooperation, to bring together all of the resources and all the capabilities of the area to address these challenges, and that the GCC as an extant institution is well placed to play a role in trying to gather those elements to promote cooperation and coordination going forward. And I would say that hopefully the GCC is going to be able to step up and do that.
We have a bonus question. We've got time for one more before we go. And the question has to do with Gulf unity in the tensions with Lebanon. How do you think the responses of the GCC states toward Lebanon, just in the last day or so, reflect unity? Do they reflect more unity? Is that better than it's been in the past? Let's start, Elena, let's start with you.
Well, actually, a comparison might be useful here, and I don't have the data in front of me, but every time there's some major event in the region, the younger staff of my institute collect reactions. And so we've seen reactions to the Abraham Accords, reactions to the coup in Sudan, reactions to Lebanon. And what's interesting is that it is not always unified. Occasionally it is. Occasionally there'll be 10 or 15 states that sign on to one statement about X, whatever the event might be. Calling for stability and calm or whatever it might be in reference to the specific event. And every now and then you'll see, two of the Gulf states signed on to that joint statement, which may include countries also from Africa and other places in the world. But most of the time you don't see all 6 Gulf states signing on to one statement about X. And I know that when the GCC gets together and they have to put together like a statement for their annual conference, it's always fun to read that and try to see where the compromises were made in terms of how you talked about Iran or how you talked about this or how you talked about that. And so to get back to your question on Lebanon, I think it's similar where, in this particular case, you have the UAE, Saudi, Kuwait, probably Bahrain, I can't remember offhand, has had a certain reaction, but Oman will always have a more neutral reaction. Qatar tends to have a different reaction than the Saudi sort of UAE Bahrain camp. And so I think you'll kind of see that going forward. I don't necessarily think that tells us a ton that we don't already know, but I definitely don't think there's like a unified 6 that all kind of group together on every issue.
Kristian, Lebanon.
Yeah, just adding on what Elana had just said, I think for me, just maybe the one reaction that I maybe wouldn't have expected was Kuwait being perhaps more closely aligned with Saudi UAE position. And that might be an indication of travel under the new leadership in Kuwait, especially the new Crown Prince, who is more perhaps hawkish than his predecessor. So I think that was something to watch. I think we did see, actually, it was interesting in February this year when the US released a report on the Khashoggi killing. We did see the Gulf leaders rally around the Saudis then, and quite strongly actually. And we're seeing to some extent the leaderships in the Gulf rally around the Saudis now as well. So in that sense, it's the second time it's happened, and so it's part of a pattern where you kind of hang together at a time of external uncertainty.
All right, let's do one final question for you, Ambassador, and that's the GCC states, we discussed this just a little bit earlier, are moving away from an oil-based economy. If we look out 20 years, 30 years, or beyond, what is the future of the economy for the region?
Well, again, you've got a number of factors that are really going to drive developments. You have the demographic factor, the fact that all of these societies, all of these economies have gone beyond the capacity to have the old way of doing things, the very public sector focused approach where everybody had cradle to grave care. Everybody got, or at least all the males got, good government jobs when they got out of school that didn't demand very much from them. All of those things are no longer feasible as these societies have developed. They've grown more complex. Women have come into the economies in a major way. And so we're going to be seeing a change. I think that most people seem to believe that the analysis of Vision 2030 and the similar kinds of plans that we've seen elsewhere in the Gulf are pretty clear. They need to move away from a fossil fuel exporting based economy to diversify. Several of us had the opportunity to visit Saudi Arabia a little bit earlier this year, and the developments, the changes that we saw in Saudi Arabia are amazing. I don't think that any one of us on that delegation had expected or anticipated the kind of dynamism that we were seeing. the way private sector is coming forward and making these changes. And even the major, whether you're talking about ADNOC or Aramco or the other major oil companies that are in the process of trying to figure out how they're going to play a role in the future. What are they going to do as the world moves towards renewables? How are they going to be a part of that transition? What are they going to do, whether you're talking about blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, carbon capture, all of these different things. And so I think that at least for the wealthier Gulf states, you're going to see them trying to develop strategies and programs that are going to take advantage of their own capabilities in order to be at the cutting edge of this. The challenge is going to be, and I think that Elena talked a little bit about, what's going to happen as you have more winners and losers within the GCC. What happens with Oman or Bahrain that perhaps don't have the resources to keep up with their richer cousins, and how is that going to be accommodated within the GCC region? This is going to be, again, one of the big challenges that the region is going to confront over the next 10 or 20 years.
Thanks very much. On behalf of the Gulf International Forum, I want to thank all our panelists for participating today in the opening session of the Gulf International Conference, the 4th annual. We'll be here all week, as they say in show business, where there's more to come throughout the week. So thank you for joining us. Panelists, thank you in particular, and we'll see you all soon.